A report last week from the government's Social Mobility Commission concluded that there are now 600,000 more children living in relative poverty than in 2012. The report went on to say child poverty rates are projected to increase to 5.2 million by 2022. What does the Prime Minister think caused that?
I must say that I think he's completely wrong in what he says about poverty. Absolute poverty, relative poverty have both declined under this government, and there are hundreds of thousands, I think 400,000 fewer families living in poverty now than there were in 2010.
Keir Starmer.
Mr. Speaker, the Prime Minister says poverty has not increased. I've just read a direct quote from a government report, from a government commission produced last week, which says it's gone up by 600,000. I gave the Prime Minister the number, 600,000. He didn't reply. The report goes on to say, and this is a real cause for concern, and the Prime Minister's chuntering, you might want to listen. Yes. Real cause for concern, because the Commission goes on, I'm sure the Prime Minister's read the report, that it's even... They are really concerned that these projections were made, 5.2 million, before the impact of COVID-19. And they go on to say, which we expect to push more families into poverty. This is a serious issue. I'm sure the Prime Minister would agree that an even higher child poverty rate would be an intolerable outcome from this pandemic. So what's he going to do to prevent it?
Mr. Speaker, I've just understood what the right honourable gentleman is talking about, what he calls an anticipated rise, rather than a rise that has actually taken place. I think a new concept is being introduced into our deliberations. What we're talking about was what has actually happened, Mr. Speaker, which is a reduction in poverty. And I think everybody with any fairness would acknowledge that this government has invested massively in protecting the workforce of this country. 11 million jobs protected by the coronavirus job retention scheme, unlike anything done anywhere else in the world. £30 billion worth of business loans, and we intend to make sure that we minimise the impact of coronavirus on the poorest kids in this country. And one of the best ways in which we could do that, by the way, Mr. Speaker, would be to encourage all kids who can go back to school to go back to school now, because their schools are safe. Last week I asked him whether he would say publicly that schools were safe to go back to. He hummed and he hawed. Now's his time to say it clearly. Schools are safe to go back to. Mr. Speaker, your witness.
Keir Starmer.
Mr. Speaker, the Prime Minister obviously hadn't got the first idea what the Social Mobility Report actually said last week, a government body, and he talks to me about consistency and U-turns. The government's had 3 U-turns in the last month. First we had immigration health charges, then we had MPs voting, and then we had free school meals. The only question now is whether U-turns at the dispatch box before or after. On the 26th of March, the Communities Secretary told council leaders directly and in terms, this was a letter to council leaders and a speech, the government stands ready to do whatever is necessary to support councils in their response to coronavirus. Does the Prime Minister believe that the government has kept that promise?
Mr. Speaker, we'll put £3.2 billion extra into local government to tackling coronavirus. But I must say, we didn't hear an answer, did we, Mr. Speaker? How can he talk about tackling the effect of coronavirus on the most disadvantaged? It's the most disadvantaged kids, Mr. Speaker, who need to go back to school, and it is those groups which, unfortunately, at the moment are not going back to school. Let's hear it from him for one more time. Will he say that schools are safe to go back to? Come on.
Starmer. Mr. Speaker, this is turning into opposition questions. If the Prime Minister wants to swap places, I'm very happy. We could do it now.